And joining me now is Neale Hanvey, a Member of Parliament for the Alba Party in Westminster, and in fact the Group Leader for the Alba Party in Westminster. Neale, you were there this week because I'm pretty sure I saw you sat on the other side of Parliament from me. Before we go on to the Speaker, what was the SNP trying to achieve, particularly in terms of Scottish politics, which is why I ask you about it, by putting forward this very differing position than the Labour Party and seeking to divide Scottish Labour MPs and other Labour MPs from their leader in Westminster?
First of all, I wouldn't characterise it in the way that you did, Jake. I think the SNP's motion, perhaps not perfect, but I think it was sincerely lodged. It was their opposition day, one of only 3 that they get in a year, and it's absolutely their right to put forward a motion. I think the point that I would make around the whole burach that occurred is that my reading of the order paper that day was that this is such a significant issue, such an enormous humanitarian crisis, that I would have hoped that some cross-party working would have happened in advance of the debate, and that we wouldn't have found an order paper with 4 competing motions, one motion, 3 amendments from Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and that there wasn't an opportunity somehow to ensure that some of the nuances that were debated over during the course of the afternoon's debate couldn't have been ironed out, and we would not have. We would have then had a much more constructive debate, and that was the content of my contribution. Was this is so important? Why can't the parties, the main parties, work together to come to some consensus and not squabble and use a partisan approach in the chamber when we're dealing with an issue that concerns every person in the country, regardless of their political views?
And Neale, the great tragedy of this is we're not discussing the contribution that was made by you and other members of Parliament to this debate and the very serious issues that were debated on the day. We're spending the entire time talking about parliamentary process, but that to some extent is what is dominating these debates. I guess from what you're saying, you would have voted for the SNP's amendment because it's very clear for people who want an immediate cessation of any fighting whatsoever in Gaza. That yes, would have been the amendment to vote for. And I, as a Conservative, I wouldn't have voted for it. I would have been quite critical of many of its measures. But what do you think the way of redressing the balance is on this? Do you think the government should come forward and give the SNP an additional opposition day debate? You correctly say that they only get 3 a year. An additional debate where their amendment or their proposition that they bring forward the government MPs should have the right to vote on it whole, perfect and untampered with by any amendment, whether it be government, Labour or Liberal Democrat. Do you think that's the solution?
Well, that's a matter for Stephen Flynn to discuss with other party leaders and the Speaker's office. I think it was regrettable, to say the very least, that the Labour Party sought to hijack the SNP's opposition day debate. That needs to be remedied. I think that goes without saying. I think there's 2 significant points that I would make. First of all, is that we mustn't cave in to any pressure to exercise our freedom of thought and freedom of expression, particularly in Parliament. We must be able to speak cleanly and clearly, and I think that's a principle that I have tried to embody across a whole range of things. In fact, it's led to some challenges in my own political career. But the second one is the second point. I think the most important point really is that the idea that the leader of the opposition interfered or attempted to politicise the office of the Speaker has to be looked at. And I wrote last night to the chair and members of the Privileges Committee asking them to investigate the accusations that have been made that the leader of the opposition or his agents did apply pressure to the Speaker's office in an attempt to cause the disruption that we saw in Parliament on Wednesday. And I think that's a fundamental, if you're going to talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, then we can't have politicisation of the otherwise impartial office of the Speaker, who is there to ensure that business is conducted in a proper manner. And so that's my main concern, is not necessarily the decision that was taken by Mr. Speaker. And there are issues that need to be looked at there. But the fundamental accusation that his office was in some way politicised by any of the political parties in the chamber needs to be carefully scrutinised.
Neale, you're right to seek scrutiny in that, because, of course, that is an accusation that has been denied both by the Speaker, and Keir Starmer has issued a statement together today, which I read out earlier, which has an absolute categorical denial attached to it. One of the things the Speaker has said, and you either take him at his word or think it's a mixture of the two, or not, is that one of the reasons he did this is because of the intimidation of members of Parliament. We've heard from the Home Secretary today, James Cleverly, that the intimidation of politicians at their home is completely unacceptable. Tobias Ellwood, a Conservative colleague, had his home targeted. Have you ever suffered from that sort of intimidation at your home address or in your role as an MP?
Oh, yes, I've had murderous threats. I've had vexatious actions taken against my office. I've had threatening emails, threatening messages on social media because of my political views, particularly when it comes to sex-based rights and the protection of sex-based rights for women and LGBT people within the trans debate. And that hasn't dissuaded me from being frank and forthright in my opinions, because I don't believe that as a politician I should cave into those types of threats. It's regrettable that it happens and that it's continuing to happen. But if democracy is to mean anything, then freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and freedom of speech must be protected. And those who have the courage to continue to speak out have to do so with the courage of their convictions.
But Neale, look, I mean, that's a very brave and laudable position to make, but let's make no bones about it. 2 of our colleagues have been murdered in relatively recent times. Do you ever wake up one day and think, is it worth it? Is this level of threat that MPs are clearly under? We've heard a lot about it this week. We've seen the evidence with those appalling murders. Do you ever wake up and think, is this really worth it? Is it worth dying for my job, potentially? Hopefully it won't happen, of course.
Well, I mean, I'm not completely altruistic here. Of course, it's a worry, and it's incredibly unpleasant to be bullied, harassed, and bullied and harassed not only by members of the public and threatened, but to also have experienced that from former colleagues. So, yeah, it's very unpleasant, but if democracy is to mean anything, then it requires people to have the courage to stand up and speak loudly and clearly. And I feel an absolute responsibility to the people whose views I represent when I make my contributions. I feel it's only right and proper that I do that as cleanly, crisply, and clearly, and without any particular sense of grievance or grudge, but I just try to speak and stick to what I believe is the truth. Because if we don't continue to do that, then democracy ceases to exist, and that's just a terrible price to pay. That's an unacceptable price. We must, do everything that we can to promote and protect our human rights and to ensure that democracy prevails.
Neale, thank you so much for joining us, speaking with feeling, honesty and integrity there on behalf of the Alba Party, as you always do.